Hey there, everybody. Paul Rabola here. Another big discussion, another live stream this evening. This one close to my heart: how to leave an inheritance to your grandchildren. So, want to share really four different parts to this live stream. One is when I actually tell you my story and why this topic is relevant to me, and then we'll talk about some of the issues involving why why grandparents. What are the different reasons grandparents typically leave an inheritance to their grandchildren? Number three, we'll talk about what are some of the decisions that you'll need to make if you want to leave assets to grandchildren. And then four, we'll talk about what are some of the kind of legal techniques and what's involved. So good to see Larry here. They didn't call you jury. Okay, fantastic. So Larry, you've been under the gun for jury duty, but you've escaped it. So welcome everybody here, and good to see you. Everybody else here. So if you got some comments, questions, experience in this area that you can share and benefit with everybody, feel free to throw it in the chat. We'll get to it after we present some information here. Okay, let's jump right in. Normally I don't talk too much in my YouTube videos or on my live streams about my life personally. Yeah, I've mentioned I have a wife and we have 5 kids, and oldest 3 are already lawyers, 2 are in law school. That's about as far as I get about my personal life. But I'm gonna tell you a little bit more about my personal life because it impacts our topic here this evening. My grandfather, who I never knew, he was a petroleum engineer for a company called Humble Oil that was acquired by Exxon. My grandfather went to Stanford University. Apparently, he was very intelligent, but he died in 1940. So I know he was young, never knew him. And I was born in 1965, 25 years after my grandfather passed away. But he apparently, while he worked, died when he was 40 or 41 or 42. He had acquired a few shares in Humble Oil. And then my grandmother, his wife, died in 1973, owning some shares in Exxon. And my grandmother had 3 or 4 kids, and she had a slew of grandkids. And for some reason, my grandmother did her will. And I remember reading her will many, many years ago. But for some reason, she was inclined to leave a few shares of Exxon stock to her grandchildren. Of course, she left the bulk of what she had to her children, but she did leave a few shares to her grandchildren. And at the time we acquired those shares, I think back in 1973, they weren't worth anything. But I think I was 8 years old, and those shares just sat at a time when Exxon was splitting, going through stock splits. And I was by no means a trust fund kid or anything like that. But I would say what my grandmother did to actually include her grandchildren, of course, left the bulk to her children, but included her grandchildren, and it did have an impact on my life. I was able to didn't have to worry about student loans, and I was able to go to college and then go to law school. And what my grandmother did for me, it covered that expense. And even after law school, when I went to Boston University for a year, earned a master's degree in tax law, I was able to cover that expense through what my grandmother had left me. So, and it just enabled me to kind of start my life on solid footing, without debt and other financial problems that people have when they start their lives. So, probably even had an impact on me as I worked for 3 or 4 years for big law, and then I decided big law is not for me. I'm going to go out and venture out and kind of do my own thing. And knowing that I had a little bit of a security blanket there from my grandmother, big impact on me. So I always like it when I hear. I never try to tell grandparents to do that, and never even share that story with grandparents who are on a Zoom call with me and we're talking about designing their estate plan. But always kind of feels good inside when somebody brings up the topic. Hey, Paul, I'm thinking about leaving something to all my grandkids. Let's talk about how we might do that. And so that always triggers that story about my grandmother back in the day. So anyway, with that being said, let's jump into what are some of the reasons why grandparents leave an inheritance to their grandchildren. It's not always just, Oh, we love our grandkids. Let's leave them in inheritance because we love them and we want to include them. It's not always quite that simple. So there's several reasons people have expressed to me as to why they're leaving an inheritance to their grandchildren. Because I would say, more often than not, it's the typical, if grandparents talking to me on a Zoom meeting and they're like, we just want to leave everything to our children equally, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's the norm. But it's not uncommon to hear people say, I think we want to include our grandchildren. And so, again, there's different reasons why people do that. Um, one is one is sometimes, and I'm not saying this is you, I'm not saying you're that child, but a lot of grandparents have told me, we're concerned that if we leave, our a share to this child, our grandchildren will never get any benefit from that. Our If we leave, this chunk to our child and don't specifically include our grandchildren in our estate plan, when it gets to our child, they're going to blow it. Their spouse is going to blow it. They can't handle money. So some people actually leave an inheritance to the grandchildren because they fear that their children won't preserve that inheritance and have the opportunity to pass something along to the grandchildren when the children pass away. So that does trigger people to say we need to include our grandchildren, whether we want to or not. We need to make sure our grandchildren get some benefit from us, because if we just leave it to our children might squander it. It never gets down to the grandchildren. So that's one reason. Another reason grandparents leave things to grandchildren is they want to provide. Maybe the reason my grandmother did it, they want to provide for funds for college for the grandchildren, or they just want to provide that those grandchildren maybe just a head start on life, whether it's $25,000 or $10,000 or $200,000. It doesn't really matter. Well, it matters, but it can be any amount. But some grandparents say we not only want to acknowledge our grandchildren in our estate plan, but we want to make sure, as hard as it is for grandchildren and people who are in their teens and 20s or even younger or a little older these days, grandparents are like, boy, life is hard. Let's leave something to the grandchildren. The grandchildren have given us so much pleasure. And so typically when that's the case, we'll talk in a minute about maybe how much goes to the children and how much goes to the grandchildren typically. Some people, and not uncommon, I've heard this many times, people tell me, Paul, and sometimes they'll say, I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but we don't have a relationship with this particular child. So we have 3 children, great relationship with 2 of our children, but you know what? The relationship with the 3rd child is estranged. So what we want to do, Paul, is we want to leave what would have been that child's share to that child's children. So we don't want to penalize the grandchildren, but we are estranged from the child. So sometimes they'll tell me of our 3 children, let's leave 1/3 to each of these 2 children, but we don't, because of our poor relationship with this 3rd child, I want to make sure that their share goes to their children. So that's, just other things we hear, right, wrong, or indifferent. I've heard all of that. And quite frankly, other people just say, we want to leave something to our grandchildren because we just love our grandchildren. And so that's great to hear that. It's not about the relationships. It's not that people are estranged. They're just like, we just want to leave something to our grandchildren. So there's a bunch of different reasons. Now let's start talking about what some of those decisions that you have to make when you decide, okay, let's include our grandchildren in our estate plan. So one of the first decisions is how much? How much do you leave the grandchildren? So it's often done, or not, I guess it's always done either as a dollar amount to the grandchildren or a percentage of the estate. Let's do the percentage one first, which is less common. So maybe parents will say, we have 3 children and we have 7 grandchildren. Let's leave 50% of our estate to be divided among our 3 children, and let's leave the other 50% of our estate to be divided among the 7 grandchildren. So each child gets really more than what each grandchild gets. And grandparents feel kind of good about that because they feel like the children should receive the bulk. And that 50-50, it could be 60-40, it could be 75-25. But I'd say it's more common for grandparents to say, okay, our estate is worth about $3 million. I'll tell you what, let's do. We have 7 grandchildren, 3 children. Let's just stick a dollar amount on what goes to each of the grandchildren. And they might say $25,000. They might say $50,000. They might say $100,000. And so it kind of makes sense to those grandparents. Hey, let's leave each of our grandchildren $50,000. 50 times 7 is $350,000. We have a $3 million estate. So if when we die, our estate is worth $3 million, then 1.9 or 2.05 million would go to our kids. That seems right. And then roughly whatever else would go to the grandkids. So some grandparents get a little concerned about, boy, if we leave $150,000 to each of our grandchildren and the rest to our children, yes, if we were to die today, the rest would be a big chunk for the children. But what if when we die, either the market collapsed or we had to spend a lot of our estate on long-term care expenses? If we leave $150,000 to each of our grandchildren and the rest to our children, if we die today, our children are going to get the bulk of what we have. But let's say we do have 6 grandchildren when we die, and we left each of our grandchildren $150,000. That's $900,000. What if we have a $3 million estate now, but what if we have to deplete $2 million of it on long-term care costs? Then we die with $1 million, our grandchildren get $900,000, and then our children only split the remaining $100,000. You don't see estates typically diminish from 3 million to $1 million. What typically happens is just through market growth and appreciation, that 3 million continues to go up because the grandparents aren't spending money in their later years unless they're spending it on long-term care expenses. But typically with a $3 million estate, it's going to grow and they're going to spend some, and it's typically not going to be depleted by much, if any, because it will grow, and then some of that growth would be used to fund long-term care expenses. So just know that there is this kind of dollar amount or percentage way to leave things to grandkids. Maybe the safe way is the percentage. Like I said earlier, 50% to be divided, or let me change it up, say 60% divided among our 3 children. So each child gets 20% each. And then the 40% to be divided among all the grandchildren. And so they'll each get a lesser amount. And if the estate goes up or the estate goes down, everybody's proportionately kind of the same. So it doesn't get kind of less fair or out of whack when the estate goes up or down when you leave percentages to everybody. All right, and then there's the decision of if you're going to leave assets to grandchildren, do you leave it out of your retirement accounts, or do you leave it out of your other estate assets? The cash, the brokerage account, the value of the home. What should you leave grandchildren? Well, before this Secure Act took effect, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, it did make sense to leave traditional IRA retirement account assets to grandchildren because the required minimum distribution rules required that very young grandchild beneficiary to take required minimum distributions over the grandchild's remaining life expectancy. So those grandchildren could stretch out those IRA distributions or distributions from the inherited IRA over sometimes 60, 70, 80 years, really deferring income tax on those distributions from the inherited IRA. But the Secure Act wiped all of that out and said if you leave retirement account assets to a non-spouse, they got to take it out within 10 years after you pass away and pay the income tax. They can't stretch it out over their life expectancy unless they fall under one of these rare exceptions, chronically ill and other rare exceptions. So now, if you do leave an IRA to a minor grandchild, they have until 10 years. I believe it's 10 years after they reach the age of 21. So they've got to take it all out and pay income tax on it by the time they're 31, instead of stretching it out over their remaining life expectancy. So not as much of an incentive these days to force the grandchildren's bequest to be made out of the IRA in order to defer all of that income tax. So anyway, some decisions to be made there. Another decision to make when you're trying to figure out how to leave assets to grandchildren is the old, do you leave it to them outright or do you leave it to them in trust? If at the time that you're creating your estate plan, those grandchildren are minors, they're young, they're 3, 5, 7, you're probably going to even have more grandchildren before you pass away, then you're going to leave those assets, or you certainly should leave those assets in a trust for those grandchildren for a lot of reasons. You name the right trustee of that trust for the grandchildren to manage the assets for the grandchildren, and you designate at what point the grandchildren can control that inheritance themselves. You'll probably select an age that's later than the age of majority or age 18. So a common example is, you know what I leave? I leave $100,000 to each of my grandchildren, but if they're not yet 25 years old when I pass away, it's going to go into a trust for them. Many grandparents say, I want the trustee of that trust for my grandchild to be the parent of the grandchild who is my child. So that way, your child can be the trustee of a trust that manages the assets for your child's children. As long as everybody's responsible, the children are good and all that, all the relationships are okay. We see a lot of grandparents do that. And then the other decision is, at what point does this trust for the grandchild or grandchildren terminate, where that trustee is required to turn the assets over to the grandchild? So I've been spending some Zoom calls for the last few days with a grandparent who's doing just that. They're leaving a rather large inheritance to their grandchild, naming their child, who's the parent of the grandchild, as the trustee. We had a conversation about how long should that trust last after the grandparent passes away. And in that particular instance, while it may sound like, what are they doing? It made a whole lot of sense, because the grandparent has a lot of confidence in their child as the trustee of a trust for their grandchild. So we said, when the grandparent passes away, assets go into a trust for the grandchild. The child will be the trustee. We said that trust will last until the grandchild reaches the age of 45 years old. Well, why so long? Because they don't know how that grandchild's going to turn out. And if the grandchild turns out fantastic, mature, responsible, then the child can always use their discretion to make distributions to the grandchild for the grandchild's health, education, maintenance, and support. So it's not like that money's locked up until the grandchild's 45th birthday. So there is a vehicle there for the child to be able to make distributions for reasonable needs that the grandchild may have, even if they're younger than 45. But however, if that grandchild turns out to be kind of goes rogue and makes some bad decisions, you know what all those potential bad decisions are. They squander money, they get on drugs, they drop out of school, they hang out with the wrong crowd. By the grandparents saying this trust for our grandchild will last until the grandchild is 45, now if that grandchild is 25, is 30, the parent of the grandchild can say, I'm not turning this money loose on a grandchild who can't make good decisions. So the safe thing to do is have that term last longer than you might think it should, just in case it would be inappropriate to dump a bunch of money in a grandchild's lap. So there's some decisions there on when that grandchild would be entitled to the trust principal, assuming you don't want to leave it to them outright or just in one big lump sum. All right. Another option, especially if you're going to leave a bigger chunk for the grandchild, is maybe you or your grandchild is fortunate enough where you're leaving them $1 million in a trust, or maybe it's 200,000 or 300,000. Doesn't really matter, but maybe a little bit more than the normal just token appreciation bequest to a grandchild. What you may do, especially if that grandchild is young, let's say the grandchild is 12, 13 years old, but you want to make sure, and you're leaving them $1 million. I bet if I were to ask for some volunteers who would volunteer to be a grandchild of someone who would leave them $1 million, we'd get a lot of hands raised. But nonetheless, it happens, and grandparents, they want to take care of their family. Can't blame them. So they leave that $1 million to the grandchild, and they never know who that grandchild is going to marry. We know the divorce rate these days is, I don't even know what it is. If you know what it is, put it in the chat, but it's high. And so the grandparents are worried, well, if I leave $1 million to my grandchild, and if my grandchild later gets divorced, are they going to lose some or half or all of their inheritance because they got married and then they got divorced? So sometimes, let's take that example where the grandparents left $1 million in a trust for the grandchild, and said, name the child as the trustee, and said that trust would last until the grandchild is 45. Well, often what we say in those trusts is the trust assets don't just get dumped into the lap of the grandchild on their 45th birthday, because the problem with dumping the assets into the lap of the grandchild on their 45th birthday is once the grandchild receives those assets, they might mix up or commingle those assets with other assets that they have with their spouse. And then if they get divorced, they lose half or more of their inheritance. So oftentimes when grandparents leave things to grandchildren, particularly if it's a chunk like $1 million, then we'll say, okay, we're going to leave it to a trust for our grandchild. Child is going to be the trustee and then at age 40, when the grandchild reaches the age of 45, it stays in the trust, but then the grandchild becomes the trustee of their own trust. And so really those assets, they stay in that grandchild's trust for that grandchild's lifetime. The grandchild just becomes the trustee at age 45, and they can control and make distributions to themselves. But by leaving those assets in the grandchild's trust for the grandchild's lifetime, it makes it far less likely that those assets will ever get mixed up or commingled with assets that other assets that the grandchild has with their spouse. So if the grandchild gets divorced, grandchild keeps their trust. Grandchild and spouse split other assets they've acquired during the marriage, keeps all those assets in the family. Another big question is when you're leaving things to grandchildren is, let's say you have a family, they have 3 children, and then one child has 5 children, one child has 2 children, and one child doesn't have any children. And so if the grandparents say, yeah, we're going to leave $200,000 to each grandchild and leave everything else to our children equally, on its face, that sounds pretty cool. Each grandchild gets $200,000, and then the kids split what's left. But one child has 5 children, and the child who has no children is saying, well, wait a second here. That doesn't seem fair, although this is not the decision of the children, it's the decision of the grandparents. But the child with no children is saying, that's not fair, because my sibling who has 5 children, that family is getting a lot more of our parents' assets than I am. Because if $200,000 was left to each grandchild, and one child had 5 kids, that's $1 million that's going to that one child's children off the top. And then the children split what's left. And so grandparents have a decision to make. When we leave something to each of our grandchildren, because our children have different numbers of children, do we want those bequests to the grandchildren to come off the top, and then just what's left gets divided among the children equally? Or do we want what's going to the grandchildren to be to reduce their parents share. And that, if you do it that way, then it's the same amount going to each family. So there is no right or wrong there. It's just a personal decision. But know that if you're considering leaving something to the grandchildren, those are things that you need to consider. It's likely that those are certainly things that are going to be going through the minds of your children. So be aware of that. Now let's go. Kind of our last thing is not necessarily our last thing because we've got some chat to go, but this is the technique of how it's done. A lot of different terms out there. I just want to start getting you familiar with some of the terms. People throw around terms like living trust, testamentary trust, irrevocable trust, grandchildren's trust, bloodline trust. So let me kind of throw out some of the terms that are commonly used. People will leave things to their grandchildren legal technique wise a few different ways. Sometimes grandparents will have a will. Then the will says, when I pass away, I leave assets to a trust for my children, my grandchildren, and then all of the terms of that trust are incorporated in the last will and testament of that grandparent. So that's one way to do it. That's grandparent has a will, and inside of that will, there's what's called a testamentary trust. That's one way. A second way is grandparents have a will, and then the will says, when I pass away, I leave $200,000 to the Pebbles Flintstone Trust. And then there's a separate, what I call a standalone Pebbles Trust. That's a separate instrument. And so when grandparents die, assets, the will says, I leave $200,000 to the Pebbles Trust. You have a separate trust instrument, no problem there either. Another way to do it is through your living trust. Maybe Fred and Wilma Flintstone are my favorite estate planning couple. Maybe they set up a living trust in order to avoid probate. They transferred assets to their living trust, and then their living trust instrument says how everything goes when they pass away. Maybe in their living trust instrument, it says when Fred and Wilma die, $200,000 will go in trust for our grandchild Pebbles, and here's all of the terms of the trust right there in that living trust. So there's the Fred and Wilma living trust, and inside, incorporated within that Fred and Wilma living trust, is another subtrust, maybe called the Pebbles Trust. So all within the Fred and Wilma trust, the terms of the grandchild's trust are incorporated in that one instrument. Or the Fred and Wilma trust say, when we pass away, we leave $200,000 to a separate standalone trust called the Pebbles Trust. And then there is this standalone Pebbles Trust on the side. Maybe it has no assets in it until Fred and Wilma die, and assets are transferred from Fred and Wilma's living trust to the Pebbles Inheritance Trust, and the successor trustee of the Fred and Wilma Trust would see to that. So I just wanted to talk about some of those: will, testamentary trust, will, standalone trust, living trust, subtrust, or living trust to separate standalone trust. A bunch of legal mumbo jumbo, but hope that helps. All right, now let's move over to our chat. Let's jump right in. As almost always first, Larry. So good. I'm glad you've been looking forward to the discussion. There's just a lot of nuances with leaving inheritances to grandchildren. You got to be careful. You've got a lot of people involved. You've got children involved. You probably have the spouses of children who want to chime in with their 2 cents. You've got, of course, the grandchildren. Some of them are married. Some of them are adults. Some of them are minors. And so even some people say, I want to leave things to my great-grandchildren. So there's similar things. A lot of the discussion about how to leave things to grandchildren would also apply if you leave things to great-grandchildren. All right. So, Des and Dos says, hi, Larry. Okay. So people are now getting Paul and Larry confused. We're just both such fixtures on these live streams that I guess people are mixing us up, but that's okay. And good to have you here. Ann saying hi to Larry, like the interaction. Larry saying hi back to Ann. Another Ann says, is it true? Yes. So, what we focused on in this live stream, we talked about just grandparents keeping everything that they own and then providing that upon their death. And it could be upon the first spouse's death where things could go to the grandchildren, or it could be only when the surviving spouse dies that things go to grandchildren. That's what we were talking about here, is what happens when grandparents die and they will leave things to grandchildren. But yes, very common for grandparents to make gifts to grandchildren. Your $15,000 number has been adjusted a couple of times for inflation over the years. For 2024, it's now $18,000. And the beauty of it is, yeah, you can do that gifting of $18,000. You can do it into 529 plans for your grandchildren. You can do it into what's called crummy trusts for your grandchildren. That'll be a topic for another live stream. What I like about that is you can max out the gifting to grandchildren in a trust. And then in addition to that gifting, you can also pay their educational and medical expenses if you pay the providers directly. So if you have a grandchild, you could put and you're married, you and your spouse can each, if you want to, and if you can afford to, and you want to get the stuff out of your estate, you can leave $36,000 or give $36,000 to a trust for your grandchild. And then in addition to that, you can pay all their educational expenses, because there's an extra rule for that. So if they had $50,000 of educational expenses, you put 36 in the trust for them, and then you also pay their educational expenses of $50,000. Now you're really getting things out of the estate. And you'd be, if you have the kind of estate that would be subject to the 40% federal estate tax, for all those assets you transfer out of your estate prior to your death, you're avoiding that 40% tax on those estates that would be assessed if you leave them in your estate. Good question. All right. So this is called How, Not Why. Get on with it. Okay. I did my best, Jay. Roger, hello, greetings from Nicaragua. I have a question as a lawyer. What documents do you draft to start the probate process? Oh, well, I would say to start the probate process, you're assuming there's a will. You'll file some documents at the courthouse asking a judge to declare that the will is valid. And if the will named an executor, you'll be filing documents at the courthouse asking a judge to what I call confirm the executor. And so then court documents are produced that the executor can take to banks and third parties and handle estate matters while the estate is what's called under administration. If there was no will, it's likely that someone's going to step up and ask to be appointed by a judge as the administrator or personal representative. That term may vary from state to state, but typically that's how a probate process starts. We have 2 grandchildren. Larry, I didn't know how old you were. You mentioned one time maybe a joke about being my son, but now I understand you have 2 grandchildren from your daughter and have basically raised and supported them all along. Long story. Yeah, 21 and 23. And I've worked with them on understanding finances. Fantastic. Probably some of the best time you can spend with grandchildren is teaching them about money. As we all know, they don't get that stuff in school. How it works and the importance of retirement savings, and I will leave funds to each of them from paid up life insurance. There you go. We didn't talk about that too much, but that's another, life insurance is another vehicle to kind of create wealth. If maybe you feel like your $2 million estate should go to your children, but you want to provide for your grandchildren. So, one option is have some life insurance, so your children, inherit your estate assets, but that life insurance goes to the grandchildren. There's just unlimited options there for you to do, but that's really cool, Larry, that you are working with the grandkids. And hard decision with no grandchild. What if adult child is reckless with finances? We want to trust for So yeah, that was one of our first things, Bob, was when I talked about why people leave an inheritance to their grandchildren. Some people worry that their adult child is reckless. So they're like, we're not going to leave anything, or we're just going to leave a small portion of what that child would have received to that child. The rest of what would have been that child's share, we want to leave it to our grandchildren in a trust. We're not going to name that child as the trustee. We'll name somebody else. So the common scenario, Bob Bissell. Can I give more to my grandson than my children? Yes, you can. Would you need to add newborn grandchildren to the existing trust, or can you have? Yeah. You can say, I leave, assuming you want to leave equal amounts. Yeah, you can say, I leave $100,000 to all of the grandchildren that exist, and perhaps when I pass away. Maybe you're 60, you've got 2 little grandkids, but very likely you're going to have more. So you can write things up to include grandchildren that you have after you sign all of your estate documents. You don't have to go back and amend things or redo things every time you have another grandchild. So that would be kind of a pain. All right, fantastic. Good discussion. Good chat there, guys. Thanks so much, Larry, the rest of you, Ann, and number 2, and all of the rest of you. We're going to wrap it up here. Love to see the chat. We'll see you perhaps tomorrow, maybe even the next day. Got a lot more to share. We'll see you next time. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.